Hello there. You may be wondering why the controversial title. Now, I've been noticing a lot of things going on in the zeitgeist of media these days, and one thing that doesn't get talked about in nearly the right ways is racism. For so long has the debate about whether racism is power plus prejudice or discrimination based on race raged on. I think people have kind of forgotten about the whole point of it. So I felt a little controversial video to gain some views and show some light on the topic would be a good idea. Now, you may be wondering where the power plus prejudice definition came from. And the whole idea is that at the moment there are two sort of schools of political thought that have defined racism in their whole different ways. Originally in the 1990s, you may have seen videos of people talking about not seeing race. I mean, it was a very popular idea about then that by becoming blind to race, by just stop talking about it, as Morgan Freeman has said, you could defeat racism. I mean, you can't defeat race. You can't defeat the race. But the whole idea behind it was that if you focus on someone's race, then of course you're going to discriminate against them. So the idea behind the blind race ideology, or sort of school of thought. I mean, it wasn't really a school of thought. It was merely an idea, I think. I mean, you could argue this literally came from Martin Luther King. He literally wanted a world where people could play together, to communicate with each other, could live with each other, and ignore their differences. And generally speaking, back in those days, racism was defined as discrimination against someone based on their race. However, there is one thing that never really quite got to me. I mean, if you think about the actual basis of that definition and actually look at it, discrimination doesn't mean anything bad. It means to treat someone differently. It means to treat something differently, to separate them almost. And treating someone differently based on their race, while yes, that does seem wrong in its own, if you think about it, it's something that's pretty common nowadays. I mean, just to give an example, looking over at Twitter, how many people have made, well, it's kind of funny that this is my example because it may have changed recently, but how many times have you seen people calling for white people to die or things in that vein? Whereas whenever anything came even sort of off, it even appeared as if it was any race that wasn't white, it was immediately censored, immediately attacked, immediately demonized. And it does make me think. Now, more recently, that's actually changed. I've noticed that on Twitter and Facebook that they have apparently been cracking down on people on the left saying these sorts of things. Although there is a question of whether it's simply an excuse because they want to avoid controversy at this point, or if they actually are trying to be fair. Because before this, it hasn't been applied fairly. I've seen countless, I mean, I'm pretty sure an MP was talking about drinking male tears. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with how feminism has evolved over the last 10 years, although I'm not very familiar with it before that. And what I have seen is that, well, we have to go to the base here, because at the very root of the issue, intersectional feminism, atheism plus, modern third wave feminism, BLM, Antifa, these all come from a single school of thought. And although they're all very different and they only can be loosely traced to us at the moment, critical race theorists seem to be the origin of this whole idea of, well, looking at how people are almost inherently discriminated against based on their race, as in the system inherently oppresses them. And this all started with a group of philosophers, I believe, in around the 1920s in Germany. Now, these philosophers happen to be, well, I don't know the exact demographic, but some of them were Jewish, and when the Nazis came to power, they had to obviously leave. And since then, it has slowly gained power And it's always been this school of political thought that was sort of seen as just something that would never get any influence, something that didn't need to be debated or looked at. And I personally think that was a mistake. I mean, I've heard from some of the experts in critical race theory, the people who have been studying this over the years, that that was a mistake, and that by doing so, we've actually made the wrong choice there. But obviously, if you're a critical race theorist, you would disagree with that. You would think that's a good thing. But regardless of that, what does it mean for these people to say that racism is power plus prejudice? Where does that come from? And the simple idea behind it is that these people, they do seem to have hate for white people, at least in some circles, or at least distaste. I mean, there is a non-zero group of white people among them that hate themselves because they're white. Not because of anything they've done, although some of these people have been people that have committed crimes or sins that they regret. So perhaps that's part of it. But what I feel is at the root of the issue is that because of that, they kind of have to make it about power plus prejudice. But you might be wondering if that's all there is to it, if it's merely an excuse to allow themselves to be racist, that they've simply hijacked the word. And the truth behind that is that that's not really all there is to it at all. You see, the whole idea of these philosophers deciding about what race meant, deciding about how to this idea of creating caste system of race, the critical race theorists, was that they looked at Karl Marx's work and they saw that communism had, well, at least as far as they were concerned, it hadn't succeeded. Or at the very least, Karl Marx had gotten something wrong. And so they tried to decide how to fix it to be able to make this glorious utopia. And what they looked at was they looked at how Karl Marx had looked at things through the lens of class. He looked at through the lens of being rich or poor, being raised to be wealthy, being raised poor, etc. The working class, the middle class, and the upper class. And they decided that he was wrong to look at it through the lens of class, and instead he should have looked at it through the lens of race, which is what they then did. And this is why they're commonly called critical race theorists. Now, since it's based on race, it's very different from communism because of that, although a lot of people that subscribe to it actually approve of or even are communists, at least to my general knowledge. I mean, I'd be grateful if anyone had any actual studies on this, because I haven't heard of anything along that sort, but I'd be very interested in that sort of thing. So what does that mean then? What does it actually mean for them to look at things through the lens of race? Well, the first thing is that they have this idea that there needs to be a caste system, that people inherently need to be treated differently based on their race. And the whole idea of it was just in the same way you might have seen intersectional feminists, normal feminists, or SJWs as they're sometimes called, looking at things that supposedly offend minorities and becoming the arbiter of what that thing is. And they looked at it themselves in the same lens. They were sort of making judgments for minorities without actually asking them, without actually confronting them and asking them what they felt was bad for them. And this whole idea wasn't based on evil. Just as Karl Marx didn't base his idea on making the world a worse place. It was based on the idea that allowing things... Well, I mean, these were people who were persecuted by the Nazis as a minority. So it's not really surprising that their response to this was to come up with a political theory that protects minorities. The thing is, though, no matter how you look at it, it doesn't actually make things better for minorities. By essentially forcing people to almost hold minorities up above themselves, it actually isolates them and hurts them in many different ways. And I don't think that is a good thing at all. I don't think that can be said to be something that has made the world a better place. I mean, if you look at what's been happening over the last 10 years, jokes have been almost removed from the whole group of race, people can't make racist jokes, except about white people, it seems. They can't make jokes that are edgy these days without being considered politically incorrect. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that it's gained so much power so quickly? Why is it that groups like Twitter and Facebook are so quick to respond to this? Now, the answer to that is actually twofold. The first reason is that to a lot of businesses, most people that are their general customer base tolerate changes made because of SJWs or critical race theorists in general, simply because of the fact that, well, all of the blame goes to that group. And while they do tend to get fed up with the business, as far as I can tell, most people don't leave it. Now, that's not always the case, as seen with Disney recently with Gina Carano, and how she's now moved after being fired to a different business that seems like it may have some success for her. And a lot of people are cancelling Disney subscriptions. So it does seem that people are starting to get fed up with it. But in my opinion, it may be a bit too late. You see, this whole idea of policing language, policing thought, policing what people are allowed to express is very subtle and it's very insidious. You see, I've always held the long view that when it comes to horrible ideologies like Nazism, well, I mean, what does it even mean to say a political ideology is horrible? I mean, if we base it on history, then sure, but wouldn't communism be just as bad as Nazism then? I mean, it has actually killed more people. I mean, I have seen in the media lately that they've almost sort of apologised for communism. Well, not the apologise, but they're making a apologism for communism. They're hiding the evils that happened therein. And even back in the time of communism, at the very beginning around, well, not the beginning of communism, but the beginning of the Nazi era where the Nazis fought World War II, apparently there wasn't actually that much information about what was happening in communist Russia. And supposedly a famous American general, General Patton, said after the war, we defeated the wrong enemy, which just makes you wonder how exactly little did they know about communist Russia back then, that they had considered that the Nazis weren't the worst threat. I mean, that's considering the Nazis were developing nuclear weapons, and although they didn't reach it before the US, they did have some progress through it. Now, another thing that has upset me is back in the old days, when people were talking about being blind to race, the stigma against racists was mostly based on the idea that people who were racist were bigoted. And the thing is, you have to actually look at what bigotry is, because treating someone differently based on their race, well, how do you decide what that is? I mean, simply saying hello to someone in a different manner, looking at someone differently, having different body language, isn't all of that discriminating against them? It's treating them differently from how you might treat someone else. Now, it's actually impossible to tell whether you're treating someone of a different race the exact same, because you treat no individual person the same way. I mean, I'm sure there might be some people that say hello in the exact same manner down to the molecular structure of their hands, but I really doubt it. And one thing that does interest me is that where do we decide that someone's being a bigot? Where do we decide that someone's being problematic and that they should be shunned and ostracized or fired? I mean, back in around 2014 and afterwards, I heard a story about how some feminists got a man fired for making a dick joke in a seminar. And, well, not a seminar, but a business meeting, a lecture. And I always wondered, how would we go from this? How would things change from there? If people were, well, I mean, was it sexist to make a dick joke? I mean, we don't consider dick jokes sexist now, do we? So why is it that people were being fired, ostracized, cancelled over so many, well, things they were often innocent of, or things that just weren't that wrong to begin with. And it does seem to be that there's sort of become a cult almost around the critical race theorists. I mean, I have heard some of these groups referred to as cults before. Some people described Atheism Plus as a cult. And that was where I really got into the nitty gritty of things. That was where I first got my introduction to critical race theory. Because at the time, I'd only just become an atheist. I mean, I'm no longer an atheist, but back then I was very into atheism, very into YouTube atheism. And it was a very fascinating subject to me. I loved debating it online, I loved talking about it, I loved learning about it. And I loved learning even about Christianity along the way. It was a fascinating topic, and I actually did a GCSE in RE afterwards because of it. But one thing that really piqued me about the Atheism Plus group was that they basically demonized all of the YouTube atheists. They claimed that there were atheists in the YouTube community that were raping women and such, and they claimed there was sexism. And the thing is that that's something that's very hard to prove or disprove, because regardless of whether they're atheists or not, you can have groups of people committing such acts anywhere really. But does that mean that they have anything to do with atheism? Does that mean that atheism specifically is responsible? I mean, atheism isn't something, it's a lack of something. It's a lack of a connection to God. It's almost sort of a non-spiritual state where you only consider the material. I mean, there are atheists who consider themselves spiritualists, but for me, atheism was literally rejecting the spiritual, rejecting the paranormal, simply dismissing it as not real, as the remnants of an older man, as the remnants of a past culture that I felt was unnecessary. And because of that, I was very, very interested and very, very worried about what Atheism Plus meant. I mean, I mostly dismissed it as a cult that would probably be forgotten about soon. I never thought it would become something serious, but I was still obviously upset by it. So I certainly remembered once I saw Anita Sarkeesian gaining traction and started hearing the same YouTube atheists I'd been following for a while criticising her arguments and discussing what she'd been doing. And the thing was, I could almost argue that what they'd done was wrong, because by giving her attention, by attacking her, by oftentimes disagreeing with her, they essentially gave her more attention, they exposed her, almost. And the thing is, perhaps if they hadn't done that, I mean, it might have been inevitable that would happen, but perhaps if they hadn't done that, she never would have gotten the traction she did, and we wouldn't have seen such an uprise in critical race theory. But personally, looking at how in the mainstream this has become such a big thing, and how Gamergate, which, to be honest with you, I wasn't there for Gamergate. I was simply not there. I didn't even notice it happened. I mean, I heard about it afterwards, and I was a bit confused about what I'd missed for quite a while. I mean, I still don't really know what went on in Gamergate, other than there was corruption in games journalism. And regardless of whether it was something that you think is problematic or something that needs to be exposed to the public, or if you think it was something that wasn't worth discussing, people discussed it, and the response wasn't anything, well, wasn't anything mature. Instead, it was to demonize the whole group as sexist and such. And I mean, I've heard that this was apparently based on a small group of people that were within the group, but I don't actually know if they even knew about that group of people, or if that's really a good excuse, because if you demonize a whole group based on the actions of a few, aren't you basically doing the same thing as a racist? Aren't you basically discriminating against people? And that's the thing, I've noticed all along these critical race theories, they seem to love changing the definition of racism, because they seem to love being bigoted all along. I've seen it time and time again. I mean, when Lacey Green, for example, came out against feminism, well, not against feminism, against third wave feminism specifically, she was ruthlessly attacked over it. I mean, she's apparently had some problems with drugs around that time, so it's a little bit hard to understand the whole situation. But I mean, she wasn't the only one. There still are feminists from the older generation that look at this new idea of intersectional feminism and still think it doesn't actually represent the interests of women or protect women who are suffering in foreign countries, for example. Now, whether that's actually going to be a big issue coming forwards, I don't actually know, because I've recently seen that apparently there are feminists arguing about there being female imams. And you may have heard of the Islam is right about women meme that went around. People were printing that. And the thing is that when it comes to that school of thought and such, there is a lot of controversy, because on one side, there are Muslims who are good people. So you can't just denigrate them based on the actions of a few. And the thing is, even within Islam, there are multiple sects. And Wahhabi Islam at the moment, from what I've heard, is the most extreme, well, not extreme, but more, it's almost imperialist. It's almost an ideology in that they want to convert everyone else in the world, and that they are allowed to hide that they are a Muslim while they're in another place for the purpose of spreading Islam and granting Islam more power, essentially. And the thing is, I've always been a bit skeptical about Islam, because the whole reason why, as an atheist, I respected Christianity was because within the Bible, Jesus pushed forth some ideas that I think even today are still relevant. Ideas of pacifism, of love for your neighbour, of forgiveness, of not being a hypocrite. Now, that's actually an interesting one, because very recently the Chinese, the CCP, the Communist Government of China, has been apparently rewriting the Bible for their own purposes, to make it safe for China almost, or something that they can control. And one of the passages that they've changed is the passage where Jesus forgives, well, I say forgive, but it's more that he goes to this woman who's going to be stoned for adultery, and she says, "Let he I'm forgetting it now. Let he who has not sinned cast the first stone." And none of them cast a stone, because all of them have sinned. And it's sort of an example that, should you really judge someone when you yourself are a sinner? But in the Chinese version, they've added a passage afterwards where he returns and starts stoning the woman and says, "I too am a sinner." And that, no matter how I look at it, is just plain evil. I mean, I simply can't understand how any reasonable good person could be willing to do that without having some sort of problem with their mind. I mean, what brings you forth to put some symbolism like that in what is the Bible? I mean, I bet you there's a lot of Christians calling it satanic right now, which I find rather funny. But well, I mean, you never know. Maybe everything is Satan these days. Now, to bring it all to a close, this has been really quite a tangential stream of tangents today, hasn't it? I think we can agree that racism isn't something that's worth demonizing people over. When it comes to topics that are wrong, you don't just destroy them by hiding them. You don't destroy them by killing those who own them. You don't destroy them by simply attacking them. You destroy them by exposing light on them, because in the end, truth and reason will eventually cause them to evaporate. I mean, to just give an example, all the people who have, essentially speaking, hidden, censored people on the internet now. There's been censorship on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, pretty much everyone. Google. I mean, even Google restricts your search results now. I've noticed that they've modified search results on both Google and YouTube. You only get mainstream news when you search up something for quite a lot of topics. Anything related to politics, you will get mainstream media first, and almost never anything else, which I find rather fascinating in the current climate. But what really worries me is that as we're moving forward, there doesn't seem to be any attempt to close the divide, to start having peaceful topics where people actually come together and discuss issues maturely. Instead, all that seems to be happening is that people are demonizing more and more and more, and pushing and pushing and pushing. And as far as I can tell, it looks like one day it's going to snap. And, well, someone's probably calling this a dog whistle for me being a Nazi already. And I mean, to that person, yes, I am a Nazi. If anyone ever says that, they are a Nazi too. But, well, I am worried for the future, because as we strip away human rights, we are getting closer and closer to the evils of the past century. And if we don't start to do something about it, if people don't start going out and being active about this, trying to solve these problems, talking to people, if people just continue to just push out of their minds, out of being tired of politics, out of being tired of all this, it's not going to get better, it's going to get a lot worse, and it's going to be a lot worse for a long time. So, Commander Dante out. Peace be with you all. I'll see you next time.